Hello everybody. This past week I had the good fortune to interview Barbara Lee, who's the United States representative for a district in California in the Oakland area. And she is perhaps best known for being the sole vote, the lone vote, only one in either house of the U.S. Congress. She was the only one to vote against the 2001 authorization for use of military force that was passed shortly after 9/11, and which ever since has given presidents in both parties essentially a blank check to wage perpetual war. You may have seen the segment that we did on her and some of her Republican colleagues, or one of her Republican colleagues, that was posted earlier this week, and I'll put that in the description box here. But I also wanted to expand a little bit on some of the issues that I think her endeavor highlights. So her endeavor was to repeal the 2001 AUMF. She proposed an amendment in the House Appropriations Subcommittee for Defense, and to everyone's surprise, she received the backing from a number of Republican members of Congress, and the subcommittee in question actually adopted her amendment over the objections of the chairperson, who was a Republican. So you had Republicans rallying to the cause of Barbara Lee to adopt this amendment. This was on June 29th. And then just this past week, it turned out that Paul Ryan, in a sort of surreptitious, underhanded manner, used a procedural maneuver to essentially kill the amendment. So Paul Ryan bucked members of his own caucus who had supported Barbara Lee and got rid of this amendment, which is now essentially dead. And something that occurred to me is that, why wasn't this headline news? I mean, America has been entrenched in this perpetual warfare posture now for 16 years, and not that many people call any attention to it ever. And there's been minimal progress through multiple administrations in actually constraining the powers of the presidency to wage perpetual war worldwide. And lo and behold, you had actual movement on the issue. It was advanced because of Barbara Lee's ability to put forth a message that resonated with Republicans, one of whom I interviewed, Representative Scott Taylor, a freshman Republican congressman from Virginia who was a former Navy SEAL and who served in Iraq. Even he rose in support of Barbara Lee's amendment. So my thought was, you can imagine a media environment where a story like that could have received pretty capacious coverage. You could weave together a narrative which would have made it very compelling in whatever multimedia format you're talking about, such as cable news, such as internet kind of listicle, whatever. The point is, the story is rather dramatic, and it could have gotten a lot of attention. So what would have been the components of a dramatic telling of this story? Well, Barbara Lee was the sole vote against the initial iteration of the AUMF resolution in 2001. So it could have been somebody who was going incredibly against the grain in a very historic moment, suddenly being vindicated years later because Republicans are rallying to her cause. Republicans who served in overseas conflicts and who agree with her on the principle that, at the very least, the AUMF has to be debated in an open way. You could have even framed it as, President Trump's war-making powers could be constricted here. President Trump's own party is saying that perhaps we need to have a debate as to whether he should have the ability to make war all across the globe without any real oversight. So even the very much Trump hostile media could have covered this in a robust way, but they chose not to. The media is constantly brimming with frenzy and outrage and furor, and yet they couldn't make much time to give this issue its due. Now, I mean, it got a little bit of attention. You could pick out isolated examples here and there, but it received nothing like the sustained coverage that would have been required to actually apply pressure on legislators to advance the matter. And so because of that lack of pressure, Paul Ryan was able to simply kill it in the dead of night, meaning kill the amendment. Even, again, it's just very striking that even among the sort of resistance crowd, this wasn't a huge priority. And I think it's to Barbara Lee's credit that she always framed the issue, and she framed it to me in our interview, that in a way that kind of made the lack of debate around the AUMF an indictment of the political system writ large, rather than anything having to do narrowly with Trump. Obviously, Trump will be affected, but Trump isn't the principal reason why this debate is warranted. The principal reason is because the political establishment overall has allowed this state of affairs to continue unfettered. And even when I asked Barbara Lee about whether she thinks concerns about Trump's so-called temperament or his judgment or his personal qualities maybe impelled some Republicans in Congress to revisit this issue of whether his powers should be constrained, and I think to her credit, she didn't make it really explicitly about Trump. She said, quote, "The first thing we have to do is realize that we have to do our job, and that's regardless of who the president is. Congress has to assert its responsibility. This was true under President Bush, President Obama, and now President Trump." So she's very decidedly not making it narrowly about Trump. And I think, she was correct on the substance to do that, but perhaps that could have the effect of not enticing certain resistance-oriented media outfits to give this issue its due attention. Because nowadays in this media ecosystem, it seems you have to have a salacious, like Trump-related component or detail in order for stuff to get any real traction. This brings me back to the issue of the Russian narrative, and I don't want to dwell on this, but I think, and I don't want to get into the substance of it right now, but even if you think the Trump-Russia story is the biggest story since the crucifixion of Christ, I think you have to acknowledge that its dominance, its utter dominance in the media, in Congress, in wherever politics gets done seemingly, has had the effect of drowning out other issues which warrant serious consideration. So, in another world, Barbara Lee's AUMF amendment endeavor probably could have gotten robust coverage, but because every day there seems like there's a new nugget in the Trump-Russia saga to report breathlessly on and to plaster every cable news broadcast with, this stuff gets crowded out. I was in Washington, D.C. last week to report this story, which again you should view if you haven't already, so there will be a link in the description box. But I was in Washington, D.C., and every time I glance at a TV in some public space, whether it was CNN, MSNBC, every single time, I think without exception, maybe there might have been one exception, but every time I glanced at a public TV, they were blaring some Russia development. And if people want to follow this Russia story with with vigor, I mean, let them do so. But I think it is somewhat an imperative to acknowledge that it's causing issues to fall by the wayside, which ought to be seriously considered. So that's my roundup. There was a good article or a good essay in the London Review of Books recently in which David Bromwich, who's a very astute observer of American politics, noted that since January 20th, when Trump was inaugurated, it seems as though the tenor of American political media has grown, quote, shriller and more indiscriminate. And I would say that's true. And I would add that it seems to have grown also much more superficial in a lot of ways. And I think a perfect example of that superficiality is that in the past week, if you're an average news consumer, you were vastly, vastly more likely to have heard about the departure of Sean Spicer and the hiring of this Scaramucci character on the Trump communications team, which, both of those stories are essentially trivialities. I mean, it's very compelling to follow the ins and outs of who the White House personnel consists of, or who's saying what at the briefing room. That's compelling for hardcore politicos and people who are obsessed with Saturday Night Live depictions of Spicer and that kind of cultural politics. I mean, I can understand why you'd be really interested in that story if you're in that cohort. But you're unlikely to hear about the AUMF issue. Whereas you were vastly more likely to hear about Sean Spicer and Scaramucci. So what does that say about our current media climate? I don't know. To me, it says nothing particularly good. So I'll leave it there for now. This is all I wrote this all out on a Medium post, which went up an hour or two ago. So that will be linked as well in the description box. Please read that. Give me any feedback you might have. And that'll do it for now. So have a good evening.